would also like to thank Ivan for inviting me, and Evan and Stella had meticulously added my forthcoming essay in the in China journal, which I greatly appreciate. I also like to thank Mahalini for the logistic support, and thank you all for joining us today. I see many familiar names, my colleagues and friends participating, especially for colleagues who are in Australia currently under lockdown. So I grew up in a migrant family in Shenzhen, the first and most successful special economic zone in China. Just in case you're wondering, the chubby girl in the middle is me, and the two little boys are my cousins. They were visiting me and my parents all the way from my birthplace of Harbin, which is in northeast China. In the background, if you follow my cursor here, you can see the Chinese characters and accompanying romanization in Pinyin Minghua, which in Chinese means to enlighten China. The Minghua used to be a cruise ship, but was transformed into a hotel, bars, and restaurants all in one after its retirement. It had a special place in my childhood memories. It was a must-see tourist destination for visiting relatives and a popular backdrop for family photos. Speaking of family photos, I'll share another one with you. So following the trend among the cool kids of the early 1990s, I had birthday parties at McDonald's. So this one was located in the plaza next to the ship Minghua. This McDonald's was one of the fast food chain's first restaurants in China. Little did I realize at the time that the Minghua, like my parents and millions of other citizens in the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, was itself a migrant. Just like the people around it, the ship Minghua had a completely different identity in China's not so distant socialist past. In 1973, the China Ocean Shipping Bureau, or 中国远航运输局, purchased the Minghua from France. Between 1973 and 1976, the ship transported materials and engineers from the People's Republic of China, the PRC, to East Africa for the construction of the Tanzania-Zambia Railroad. In the aftermath of the Third Indochina War, it facilitated the repatriation of ethnic Chinese refugees from Vietnam and Chinese aid workers from Cambodia. So Matt's fascinating work actually focused on China's sponsorship of the Khmer Rouge, and Minghua also bore witness to this history. In 1983, the ship Minghua docked permanently in Shenzhen. In the following year, 1984, Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's reform, boarded the Minghua and gifted the ship with a calligraphy inscription of this new name, the Sea World, 海上世界. This is a significant political gesture that affirmed the place of market-oriented practices in Shenzhen. A global connector, ships are one of the oldest transportation technologies and have linked different parts of the world through trade, colonialism, migration, and tourism. Before the COVID-19 crisis, modern ships serving different purposes, from warships to oil tankers, from floating campuses of the semester at sea program to hospital ships, traversed the maritime world. Even though the cruise industry was hard hit by the pandemic, the importance of merchant vessels only increased. Many of us anxiously monitor the recent blockage of the Suez Canal, worrying about the potential delays of our online orders. However, beyond the Ming Dynasty junks that played an important role in the South China Sea trade, but probably did not discover the world, we know surprisingly little about modern Chinese ships. Ships like the Minghua symbolize China's transformation and its changing position in the world. If contemporary maritime trade flows under the Belt and Road Initiative illustrate China's engagement with global capitalism, the early history of Minghua reminds us of China's past commitment to revolutionary internationalism. My research tries to understand Chinese ships as social spaces, remotely serving but temporarily disconnected from the PRC state. Today, I'd like to share with you a backstory of the Belt and Road Initiative by tracing the voyages of Minghua and two other ships managed by the China Ocean Shipping Bureau. So we're going to track their voyages both as mobile vessels at sea and as a permanent presence on land. So let's first look at the Cold War era. In 1958, the PRC's Ministry of Transportation established an office in the port city of Guangzhou in the hope of developing maritime trade and circumventing a US-led embargo. In its early years, the Guangzhou office of the China Ocean Shipping Bureau assembled a fleet comprising ships such as Heping, which means peace in Chinese, and Guanghua, which means to revive China. In the early 1960s, the Heping and Guanghua made regular trips to major Southeast Asian ports, including Jakarta, Medan, Rangoon, Singapore, Surabaya, carrying passengers as well as goods such as rice, pepper, and rubber. Keep in mind that rubber had been placed high on the international embargo list by the United States. Besides trade, the ships also carry out political missions. The Guanghua facilitated the repatriation of the ethnic Chinese from Indonesia in the early 1960s, when the country implemented policies aiming to reduce the economic presence of the Chinese diaspora. The Guanghua was also in charge of the transportation of Chinese, Vietnamese, and North Korean athletes to Indonesia to attend the 1963 Games of the New Emerging Forces. So GANAFO is an international sporting event held among the radically anti-imperialist countries in opposition to the Olympic Games. In the aftermath of Indonesia's anti-communist mass violence in 1965-1966, Beijing sent the ship Guanghua on 4 trips to Medan, which is the capital city of North Sumatra in Indonesia. The Guanghua took back more than 4,000 ethnic Chinese. The majority of these passengers were expelled from Aceh. Here we see an image of Guanghua's arrival in Guangzhou in 1967. So we're probably familiar that at that time, the Cultural Revolution was already unfolding. And according to my oral history interview accounts, many Chinese Indonesians on board were really astonished by the sight of the countless Cultural Revolution propaganda posters welcoming them at the port of Zhanjiang in Guangdong. So crossing the South China Sea during the Cold War, the Heping and Guanghua were cut off from the broader Chinese society, and they were exposed to encounters with capitalist vessels and port workers. The ships were isolated and vulnerable socialist spaces. When entering the port of Tanjung Priok in Jakarta in 1962, the Heping's captain noted the arrogant gaze from an American captain who perched on the deck of his ship with his arms folded over his bare chest. When unloading goods in Singapore, the Guanghua's captain recorded that some local Chinese Singaporean porters scribbled bad slogans, quote unquote, inside the cabins. The graffiti included messages such as, "Down with the people's commune," and "There is no rice, no clothes, no bicycle, and no watch in China." The local porters also told the PRC sailors lurid tales about prostitutes. Besides the lure of corrosive capitalist thinking, the crew's loyalty to the party state was also weakened by labor disputes. For instance, sailors on the Guanghua who had worked as the People's Liberation Army Navy officers were very dissatisfied with the decrease in their income and passively resisted the captain's orders by foot dragging. So social sociologist Victoria Reyes characterizes the ship as a transit total institution because the personnel's clothing, movement, sleeping schedules, food consumption, morality, and sexuality are all often strictly regulated. On the socialist ships, 和平 and 光华, thought work or 思想工作 was rigorously conducted to protect the crew from quote-unquote provocations from imperialists and international counter-revolutionaries. During one of Guanghua's journeys in 1964 between China and Indonesia, the crew had to spend a mandatory 4.5 hours per week on collective political studies. And they have to focus on three important essays, or in Chinese, 老三篇, written by Mao Zedong, namely Serve the People, Commemorating Norman Bethune, and The Foolish Old Man Removes the Mountain. In addition, everybody was required to write a study diary or 学习日记, which is not for like private recollection, but it's actually going to be inspected by the study group leaders on board. So for the Chinese overseas in Southeast Asia, 和平 and 光华 symbolize the new socialist China and serve as vehicles for the PRC's international propaganda. On summer evenings in Rangoon in 1961, the captain of 和平 felt deeply touched when seeing crowds gathering on top of the Sula Pagoda, trying to catch a glimpse of the gigantic bright star on the ship's chimney. An elderly Chinese grandmother who had lived many years in Burma hired a sampan boat to take her around the Heping ship. She caressed the ship's gangway ladder and was reluctant to leave. When taking back the Chinese Indonesians affected by Indonesia's nationalist economic legislation in 1959 and 1960, the Guanghua organized intensive ideological indoctrination programs for the passengers during their time at the sea. Political messages about the glorious progress of New China were presented through newsletters on the notice boards, the screening of movies and documentaries, and even makeshift theatrical shows. One passenger recalled attending revolutionary music lessons every day at 8 a.m. on the deck, learning songs such as "Socialism is Good." So here we see Chinese Indonesian passengers on board of Guanghua in July 1962. And here we see baby Lin Guanghua, who was born in April 1963 on ship Guanghua during its voyage between Medan and Hanyang. Needless to say, the baby was named after the ship. So sailing on the Guanghua, the diasporic Chinese passengers' nationalist passion and revolutionary romanticism grew rapidly. But the crew on the Guanghua ship avoided talking about economic difficulties caused by the Great Leap Forward, leading to heartbreaking disillusionment among the migrants after their arrival in the PRC. Ironically, the Guanghua and Heping also facilitated public diplomacy in non-socialist ways. At most of the harbors these ships visited, cocktail parties were hosted with assistance from the PRC embassies and consulates.
Balance of power.
Sorry?
Resembled a sword of Damocles hanging over all nation states.
Sorry, is that the question?
Full stop.
So I continue. So they host cocktail parties with assistance from the PRC embassies and consulates, as well as business leaders from the Chinese diaspora communities. The guests at these occasions were mostly officials from Foreign Immigration and Customs Office, Ministries of Trade and Commerce, and the Navy. The captain would usually give gifts in exchange for favorable treatment through customs.
Some wished for a single sovereign state.
I think it's
with a supranational authority.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there is a. Would it possible to mute? Sorry for the disruption. Sorry, Matt, would you?
But this
Yes, Mike, can I get you to mute? I don't know if that's just a text to speech that's going off, but it's stopping the flow of the discussion. Thank you.
Shall I continue? Okay, I'll continue. Okay, so the host, sorry for the disruption. So the captain will usually give gifts in exchange for favorable treatment through customs clearance and other procedures. For example, in June 1961, upon arrival at the port of Tanjung Priok in Jakarta, the Heping's captain invited Indonesian officials on board for a fancy dinner and presented them with Zhonghua cigarettes, a premium brand produced in Shanghai, and bottles of brandy. So the purpose of these cocktail parties, exchange of gifts, as you could see, was that the Chinese captains were hoping they could get favorable treatment through customs clearance and other procedures. So this Heping captain hosted the dinner, give out gifts. However, the next day, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he read a local newspaper. Why? Because the newspaper reported that the hospital Indonesians had welcomed the visiting Chinese ship by organizing a banquet in its honor. So the story got reversed. So now let's shift our attention to the Guanghua sister ship, the Minghua. The Minghua's last journeys before its retirement reflected a reorientation of the PRC's diplomacy in the late 1970s. In June 1978, on its way home from Africa, the Minghua received instructions to prepare for a trip to Vietnam. So why Vietnam? You can imagine by that time, the relationship between the once quote-unquote brothers plus comrades, Hanoi and Beijing had turned sour. Under the shadow of intensifying geostrategic rivalry between the two countries, the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam faced confiscation of property, frequent police harassment, and forced relocation. The PRC decided to dispatch the Minghua to repatriate the Chinese from Vietnam. So before its departure, the Minghua's crewmen held rallies at the Huangpu port of Guangzhou, expressing great indignation at the Vietnamese authorities for returning good with evil, quote unquote, considering past Chinese assistance to Vietnam's anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles. Despite the publicity it received, the evacuation operation failed, and the Minghua returned with quote-unquote no victimized Chinese national on board. Bilateral relations continued to deteriorate and reached their lowest point when Deng Xiaoping launched an attack to quote-unquote teach Vietnam a lesson in 1979. So under Deng Xiaoping, economic growth gained priority over ideological campaigns. In his calculation, military actions against Vietnam and its Soviet backers would help China in its approaches to the capitalist world for investment and technological transfers. The Minghua bore witness to the collapse of Beijing's partnership with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. It also bore witness to the deepening of Beijing's ties with the capitalist Japan. In October 1978, Deng Xiaoping made a historical visit to Japan, a country he believed had important lessons for the PRC to learn in order to realize its goal of four modernizations. In the summer of 1979, the Minghua sailed around Japan as a Sino-Japanese friendship ship. This ship was also nicknamed Papa Liao's ship, or Liao Gong Chuan, so who is Liao Gong Papa Liao. It refers to Liao Chengzhi, who was born in Tokyo and served as a long-time director of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office under the PRC State Council. In 1979, Liao Chengzhi headed a delegation of 600 friendship emissaries on the ship Minghua. The people-to-people diplomacy between China and Japan continued on the Minghua after it made Shenzhen its home. In 1986, a Sino-Japanese Go tournament was held in the renovated Captain's Lounge on the Sea World. The event attracted the attention of board game enthusiasts and high-profile spectators, such as the top representative of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, Xu Jiatun. Yes, there was Marshal Su Yu in the backdrop, correct. So I can go back to the story about the Sino-Japanese friendship later on. So going back, so the War tournament sparked public curiosity in Japan about China's reform and opening. Japan's most prestigious newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, published a series of reports on Shenzhen and the Shoko industrial zone. Shoko, what is Shoko? So Shoko is a little more than 2 square kilometer enclave on the west coast of Shenzhen. It was arguably a special zone within a special zone because it was managed not by the local government, but by the Hong Kong office of China Merchants Group. So some of you might be familiar with the China Merchants Group. It is an important modern shipping enterprise originally established by Qing official Li Hongzhang. In 1970s, the company came under the leadership of Yuan Geng. So who is Yuan Geng? Yuan Geng was a guerrilla fighter and military commander during the Second Sino-Japanese War. He had worked in Southeast Asia as an intelligence agent in 1950s and 1960s. So he named his 2 children, both born in Indonesia, as Zhongyin, which means China, Indonesia, and Niya, which is a Chinese transliteration of Nisha from Indonesia. With his rich overseas experiences and familiarity with the commercial culture in the Asia Pacific, Yuan Geng was well positioned to supervise the Shoko industrial zone, which was the first test tube in China that accepted foreign investment. So in the early 1980s, as you can see from the picture here, Shoko looked very barren. It didn't have any tourism facility to accommodate an increasing number of investors from Hong Kong and the wider world. So in the 1960s, when working in Southeast Asia, Yuan Geng, as you can see from here, he escorted the Chinese Indonesian refugees on the ship Guanghua. So he came up with the idea of repurposing Guanghua's sister ship, the Minghua. So the Minghua had 263 guest rooms, as well as swimming pools, restaurants, and bars, and everything meet international hospitality standards. So from Yuan Geng's perspective, the retired Minghua was not just a heap of metal scraps waiting to be dismantled. It was a ready-made 5-star hotel. So in August 1983, the China Merchants Group purchased the retired cruiser and transformed it into a one-stop entertainment center within 4 months. The ship Minghua was reincarnated. Its first general manager was also a self-reinvented red engineer. His name is Wang Chaoliang. So before he migrated to Shenzhen, Wang Chaoliang obtained an engineering degree in aerodynamics and had worked in a military industrial complex in the North Chinese hinterland. So as you can imagine, Wang Chaoliang knew nothing about hospitality industry, but he was tested to oversee the refurbished Minghua ship. To make up for his lack of knowledge, Wang Chaoliang hired an experienced hotel manager from Hong Kong at more than 30 times his own monthly salary. The first batch of bartenders, housekeepers, and waiters was recruited from across Guangdong province via hyper-competitive examinations and interviews. Around Christmas 1983, Wang received orders to prepare for the visit of a VIP who loved spicy food. So who is the VIP? It's none other than the Sichuanese Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping's visit to the Minghua affirmed his conviction for China to continue economic reform. 3 days after he boarded Minghua ship, he wrote, "The development and experience of Shenzhen has proven that our policy to establish the special economic zone is correct." So in 1984, at the National Day Parade in Beijing, a scaled down float in the shape of the Minghua bearing Wen Geng's famous slogan, "Time is money, efficiency is life," 时间就是金钱，效率就是生命, appear on Tiananmen Square, making the Sea World a household name in China. Although physically immobile, the retired Minghua became a lively public space for cultural exchanges, social interactions, and conviviality. The managers of the Shekou Industrial Zone organized a city flower exhibition, as you can see from the image here, and a folk culture exhibition, both of which became nationally famous. And the folk culture exhibition on the ship Minghua attracted more than 2.5 million tourists in 1989 and 1990, and became the prototype for the hugely successful tourist site, Splendid China Folk Village, which is a theme park with collections of miniature landmarks from all across China, similar to the Taman Mini Indonesia in Jakarta. And catering to the needs of the large number of young migrant workers in Shekou Industrial Zone, the Minghua provided low-cost, high-quality leisure activities, from waltz and samba lessons to karaoke nights. Interestingly, the ballroom and restaurant on board offer special discounts, guests to whom? To the Communist Youth League members. Okay. So as Paul Gilroy shows in his study of the Black Atlantic, the ship should be understood as a living microcultural micropolitical system in motion. The PRC ships function as a distinctive type of state space in international waters, contributing to the geostrategic and economic goals of the Chinese government. When mobile at sea, these ships function as vessels not only for passengers and commodities, but also for Maoist ideology. Upon arrival in foreign ports, the ships became floating venues for public diplomacy, where local officials, PRC diplomats, and Chinese diaspora communities mingled. The Minghua's retirement coincided with China's transition from Mao to Deng. Having bid farewell to the sea and become part of the city's landscape, the ship was turned into a dynamic experimental field, or 实验场, for the market economy and the medium through which ideas travel and identities shift. Here we see a mobile ballot box parked in front of the Minghua. In Shekou in the early 1980s, Wen Geng abolished the cadre management system under socialism and introduced democratic check and balance, enabling ordinary workers to evaluate the performance of their managers through what he called votes of confidence and votes of non-confidence. The Minghua lives on after more than 2 decades at sea and almost 4 decades on land. In the 1990s, the Minghua narrowly escaped being dismantled several times. It weathered land reclamation, which is a main way through which Shenzhen urbanized and expanded its territory. It also weathered the closure of the adjacent bathing beach due to pollution. After the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, the local authorities successfully restructured Shekou with the SeaWorld, the ship Minghua, at its center. Today's SeaWorld still offers a free public square and urban green spaces, but the Brazilian barbecue, the German beer garden, the bouquet coffee shops cater largely to expats and upper middle class consumers. In the supersonic speed urban development in Shenzhen, the Minghua ship is a legend. But compared with 1980s, it is no longer a leisure-oriented public space for young workers. it provides few opportunities for upward social mobility to migrants. The ship has witnessed the decline of Mao era revolutionary diplomacy, the rise of the Deng era market economy, and the wealth and inequality it created. So this is the end of my presentation, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.